The sovereign empress broadcast her declaration across every frequency humanity had ever invented. They came to name us. We made them regret learning our names. The signal arrived on a Tuesday. Most things that end the world do. It came in on 17 frequencies simultaneously, which was the first sign that whoever sent it had done their homework. They had been listening for a long time. Long enough to know which bands we monitored, which protocols we used, which mathematical constants we trusted as markers of intelligence. The signal was all of those things at once, layered like a chord, struck from a pipe organ the size of a small moon. It lasted 4 minutes and 33 seconds. When it stopped, the silence on every NASA floor, every ESA console, every monitoring station from Goldstone to Parks was so complete that you could hear people forgetting to breathe. Nora Vasquez heard it from the orbital transfer platform, designated Way Station Kepler, which sat like a copper thumbtack pinned between Earth and the approaching ship. She was running a routine inspection on the docking latches when the alert tone came through her earpiece, and she stopped what she was doing, sat down on a crate of emergency rations, and listened to 4 minutes and 33 seconds of the most intricate, alien, terrifying music she had ever heard. She was 31 years old. She had grown up in Albuquerque. She had a younger brother named Marcus who collected vintage sneakers and could name every starting lineup of every Celtics championship team. She had a playlist for spacewalks that started with Dolly Parton and ended with John Coltrane, and she had made the playlist herself over 6 years of missions so that it hit every emotional frequency she needed to get through the strange loneliness of moving through vacuum. She had a small scar under her left ear from a childhood bicycle crash. She had been engaged once, briefly, to a man named Theo, who was kind but wanted a life that didn't leave orbit, and they had parted warmly, and she still thought about him on the long nights. None of that, she understood, was going to matter much anymore. She keyed her comm. Control, are you getting this? We're getting it, said Mission Director Harlan Osei from Houston, his voice stripped flat by distance and shock. Everyone's getting it. What are we doing? A pause. Right now, nothing. We're listening. Good, Nora said. That's the right answer. She was not the mission commander. That was Captain David Rourke, currently in the command module running system checks on the station's attitude thrusters, was a good commander. Methodical, calm under pressure, the kind of man who checked his checklist twice. He had also, Nora knew, spent his entire career preparing for a certain category of problem. Equipment failure, medical emergency, supply shortage, political fallout, and what was coming toward them from the outer solar system was not that category of problem at all. She had seen the look on his face when the signal first came through. It was the look of a man whose entire vocabulary for danger had just been made obsolete. She felt something then that surprised her. Not fear. Fear came later. She felt, first, was the same thing she had felt the day she first went Eva. Stepping out of the airlock above the curve of the Earth, with nothing between her and the universe but her suit and the tether. A kind of sharp, clarifying joy. The joy of finding out that everything was larger than you'd been told. The Sovereign Empress arrived in high solar orbit 11 days later. It was not a ship in any sense the word had prepared them for. It was a structure. The early radar returns had suggested something roughly the diameter of the continental United States, shaped loosely like a nautilus shell, its surface covered in what appeared to be geometric formations that caught light in patterns too regular to be natural and too complex to be architectural in any human sense. It moved without visible propulsion. It simply was somewhere, and then, over the course of several hours, it was somewhere else. First communication from its occupants came in the form of images, high-resolution, color-corrected, apparently rendered specifically for human visual perception. The images showed Earth, not from orbit, from the surface, from the streets. The images were recent. Recent enough that, in one of them, partially visible in the background of what appeared to be a market square in Marrakech, was a billboard for a film that had been released 6 months ago. They had been here for a while. The second communication was text, in English, in Spanish, in Mandarin, in Arabic, and in 17 other languages. It read in all of them, essentially the same way. We are the Veth. We have observed your species for 112 of your years. You are at a critical juncture. The biological and cognitive material of your world has value. The planet itself has value. We have come to take an inventory. Your cooperation is expected. Your cooperation is, to be transparent, irrelevant. We prefer cooperation. Hostility will be processed accordingly. Then, a day later, a shorter message. We will send an emissary to your orbital station. Have a representative present. The emissary will explain the process. Nora R. was not chosen as humanity's representative. She was chosen to operate the docking arm that would receive the Veth shuttle. That was fine with her. She was, as she had often been told, the backup, the person you brought along. Because every serious endeavor needed someone who could spacewalk and who was expendable enough that they could be placed in the unglamorous positions without complaint. She had spent 8 years being the third most important person in rooms full of important people, and she had made her peace with it by becoming very, very good at the unglamorous things. Ambassador Priya Shastri was humanity's representative. She was brilliant, multilingual, composed, and visibly terrified in the way that only very brave people look terrified. Not collapsed by it, but sharpened. She stood in the docking bay in a formal suit that someone had decided looked appropriately neutral, and she kept adjusting her earpiece. In a gesture Nora recognized as the gestures a person makes when they wish they could hear something other than what they were about to hear. Captain Rourke stood beside her. He kept his hands clasped behind his back. The Veth shuttle made no sound on approach. It was the size of a city bus, roughly spherical, and it moved with the particular eerie precision of something that had never needed to worry about running into anything. Docked itself. Nora's arm was unnecessary. She stood at the controls and watched the coupling indicators go from red to green without her doing anything, which was a feeling she decided she did not enjoy. The emissary was called a voice. It was 6 feet tall in the configuration it chose for this meeting. Though Nora had been briefed by analysts who had watched the approach footage and confirmed that its natural configuration was something else entirely. Something with more axes of symmetry than human bodies permitted. What they saw was a form that was almost human, proportioned similarly, walking on 2 limbs. But the skin had a quality like polished obsidian, crossed with something organic, a deep iridescent black that shifted color at the edges when it moved. Its face had eyes. 4 of them, arranged in a shallow arc. It had something where a mouth might be, a structure that moved, but not in a way that corresponded to the sounds it made, which came from somewhere in its torso. It looked at Ambassador Shastri for a long moment. Then it looked at Rourke. Then it looked at Nora. Its gaze stayed on Nora for a beat longer than the others. She looked back. It was, she thought, the way you looked at something when you were trying to figure out what category it went in. She gave it a small, flat smile, the kind she used when reporters tried to get her to say something quotable. It went into the same category as the smile. The voice spoke. Its translator rendered the speech in English through a device that hung from its collar like a pendant, a flat disc that vibrated faintly. Your world's resources have been evaluated. The extraction process will begin in 14 of your days. Biological population will be relocated to a designated zone during the process. Relocation is temporary. Most of you will be returned. Most, Nora noted. Ambassador Shastri said carefully, we need more information about what extraction entails. We have several billion people. The number is known, the voice said. Process accounts for it. Our populations have rights. The concept is registered, the voice said, in a tone that managed to be neither hostile nor dismissive, but simply final. The way you might acknowledge that you had heard something without in any way indicating that it had any bearing on anything. Compliance is expected. Non-compliance will extend the timeline and increase losses. The calculus favors compliance. Rourke said, we'd like to discuss this with our governments before. Discussion has been allocated 60 hours, the voice said. The emissary will return then for confirmation of compliance. It turned and walked back to its shuttle with the unhurried movement of something that had never had reason to hurry. The docking arm retracted. The shuttle withdrew. Nora stood at her console and watched it go and thought about the scar under her left ear, and Marcus's sneakers, and the playlist that started with Dolly Parton, and whether she would ever get to add another songs to it. Well, she said, to no one in particular. Yeah, said Rourke. 60 hours. She started calculating. This was the thing about being the backup, the expendable one, the third most important person in important rooms. You spent a lot of time doing calculations nobody had assigned you. You had time. You weren't the one being called on to give speeches or negotiate or represent. You were the one standing at the arm controls watching the important things happen. And while you watched, you thought, and over time the thinking became a habit so ingrained that you almost couldn't stop it. Nora had been thinking since the first signal. She knew the station's schematics better than anyone alive, because she had spent 8 years being Eason who maintained the things other people operated. She knew where the stress fractures ran in the docking collar, which coolant lines had been routed improperly in the original build, and patched twice since, which sensor arrays fixed, which vectors, which electromagnetic shielding had been rated for exactly what it was rated for, and nothing else. She also knew something that had not yet made it into the official briefings, because she had been the one running the inspection when the Veth shuttle docked, and she had been close enough to watch it with her own eyes. The shuttle's hull had shown ablation marks, heat scarring, not from atmospheric entry, wrong pattern for that, but from something else, something high energy and directional. Somebody had shot at it. She spent the first 20 of the 60 hours making lists. She wrote them in the margins of the maintenance logs she was supposed to be filling out, in the cramped handwriting she had developed in zero gravity, because you couldn't let your pen drift. She listed what she knew, what she could access, what the station had that the Veth might not have anticipated. Then she went and found Dr. Yuan Liang, who was Way Station Kepler's chief astrophysicist, and who was, in Nora's experience, the only person on the station who shared her habit of thinking about things that were nobody's assigned problem. Yuan was in the observation module, staring at the distant shape of the Veth vessel, Cheems. He was eating a protein bar, with the mechanical automaticity of someone who had forgotten they were eating. They have ablation marks, Nora said. He looked at her. I saw. So something out there can hurt them, apparently. What do you think it was? He chewed. Back at the ship. They've been in this solar system for a while. Maybe longer than they're telling us. There are a few things out past the Kuiper belt we've theorized about but never confirmed. He paused. Paradox stuff. Other things, maybe. Or maybe they brought it with them. Some kind of containment issue. He looked at her. Doing math. I'm always doing math. What kind? The kind where I figure out what we have that's worth anything. She pulled out the maintenance log. Look at this. The station had been built partly as a relay point, and partly as a research platform. And part of that research platform was an electromagnetic pulse array designed to study solar weather, specifically to measure the effects of coronal mass ejections on orbiting infrastructure. The array was not a weapon. It had never been intended as one. It was, essentially, a very sophisticated electromagnetic emitter pointed outward from the station's hull, capable of generating pulses of significant intensity in the microwave and lower frequency bands. It had also never been rated for the output levels Nora had been calculating. You'd burn out the array, Yuan said. Yes. You'd probably burn out half the station's secondary systems. Probably. And that ship is massive. You'd be hitting one tiny point on the hull. I know. So what's the point? Nora tapped the maintenance log. The ablation marks. They were on the aft section, near what the analysts think is their propulsion core. They were already damaged when they docked. If the damage is near something important, you don't know that. No. She looked at him. I need you to help me figure out if it's true. Yun ate the last of his protein bar and looked at the massive, distant shape of something that had come across the dark between stars and told humanity that its cooperation was irrelevant. The wrapper. Okay, he said. Show me your math. The 60 hours became 30 hours of planning and 30 hours of action, and the action was quiet. The kind of action that looked like maintenance to anyone who saw it, because Nora had been doing maintenance on this station for 4 years and she knew exactly how to look like she was doing ordinary things while doing something else entirely. She requisitioned replacement couplings for the docking arm. Standard procedure. She used the access tunnel that ran alongside the EM array housing. She replaced the thermal regulator on Junction 7, which was genuinely overdue for replacement and which nobody would question. While she was in the housing, she made 4 other adjustments that were not in any maintenance log. Yoon worked from his terminal, running spectral analyses of the Veth ship that were, he told anyone who asked, part of a standard astrophysical survey, the kind that would be valuable for the historical record. Nobody questioned it. People were dealing with the 60-hour deadline in their own ways, and most of those ways did not include paying attention to what the backup and the astrophysicist were doing. Found Nora at hour 47. She was in the EVA prep room, running through suit checks, with a focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this so many times it had become muscle memory. He stood in the doorway. "What are you doing, Vasquez?" "Suit check." "Why?" She looked up at him. Rourke was a good man. She wanted to be clear about that in her own head. He was capable and fair, and in another kind of crisis, she would have told him everything immediately. But the crisis they were in was the kind where telling the commander meant the commander had to decide whether to authorize it. And that meant committees and protocols, and the 60 hours becoming 40 hours, and then 30. And she had done the math on that too. "I'd rather you didn't ask me that specific question," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him assembling things in his mind. Her requisitions, the access logs, the time she had been spending in the EM array housing. "If it doesn't work," he said finally, "they'll know it was us. They'll know it was me," she said. "I've been careful about that." Another silence. "And if it does work?" Nora thought about this. She thought about the voice saying, "Most of you will be returned," in a tone that had been neither cruel nor kind, just administrative. The way you might say, "Most of the product survives shipping." She thought about the ablation marks. She thought about the way the emissary had looked at her, the long, evaluating gaze, and the category question it had been asking. "Then," she said, "they'll need to recalibrate." Rourke stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he stepped aside. "I'm going to be in the command module," he said. "Running systems diagnostics." He paused. "The kind that take a while." She understood. She nodded. He left without looking back, and she went back to her suit checks, and she thought about how that was the thing about people. The real thing, the thing you couldn't explain or predict, that when it came to it, even the careful ones, even the methodical ones who checked their checklists twice, could find it in themselves to step aside. She went EVA at hour 53. It was not her first spacewalk, it was her 212th. She had counted them, all of them, from the first trembling step outside the airlock above the training facility to the most recent one 3 weeks ago, to inspect the solar array. Each one was different in some way that mattered. Some different quality of light or angle of Earth or personal state that she always noticed and always filed away, because she was the kind of person who filed things away. This one was different in ways she could not have filed if she'd tried. The Veth ship hung in her peripheral vision as she worked her way along the station's hull. It did not look like a ship. It looked like a feature of the solar system. Something ancient and geological. Something that had always been there. She kept her eyes on the junction box she was moving toward, and did not look at it directly. There was a trick to this that she had learned young, looking at things so large and strange that direct attention broke your ability to function. You looked at the smaller thing, the thing in your hands, the bolt you were turning, the coupling you were checking. You kept your hands busy, she hummed. Shh. It was a habit she'd had since her first EVA, the humming, something to fill the silence inside the suit. Playlist existed partly because silence in a suit was a particular kind of silence that could swallow you if you let it. She hummed the opening bars of something her mother had sung when she was small. A song without words, a melody her mother claimed she'd invented, but which Nora had later traced to a Paraguayan folk song from the 1940s, and which she had never told her mother about because some things were more valuable as private inventions. She found the relay junction for the EM array emitter. She opened the housing. The modifications she had made 40 hours ago were still there, still clean, exactly as she had left them. She had run the numbers 5 times. Yoon had run them twice independently. The array would fire at approximately 340% of its rated maximum. The output would be directional, focused, aimed at the coordinates. Ewan had spent the last 2 days triangulating from the spectral data. The Veth ship's aft section, the already damaged region, the place where something else had already found purchase. The array would likely survive 1 pulse at this power level. Probably not 2. Nora thought about the way the voice had said, "Your cooperation is irrelevant," and how that sentence had a specific weight to it. The weight of something said by a species that had done this before, many times, to many worlds, and had learned to skip the part where the local inhabitants argued. She thought the fact that they had still built in a translation protocol. They had still sent an emissary. They had still given 60 hours. They weren't immune to communication. They had chosen strategically to render it irrelevant. That was different. She connected the relay. Pulse took 0.003 seconds to travel from the array to the Veth ship. She knew this because she had calculated it. She did not feel it happen. She was on the hull when it fired, and the only thing she felt was a vibration in the station structure. A deep harmonic that traveled through her boots and up her legs and into her chest. A sound that wasn't quite a sound, more like the memory of a very large bell. Then she waited. For 22 seconds nothing happened. Then the Veth ship, at its aft quarter, went dark. Not dark like a city blackout. Dark like something that had been on and was now off. A fundamental cessation. And the region where the ablation marks had been, the region Ewan had spent 2 days triangulating, simply stopped being illuminated from within. The geometric patterns on that section of hull went still. The shifting iridescent light, which had been continuous since the ship's arrival, stopped. Nora hung in vacuum and watched it. Vasquez. Ewan's voice in her earpiece, barely controlled. "Nora, I see it. Their aft emitter array just went down. I'm reading. There's a cascade effect in their port systems. Ever was already damaged. You just... How bad?" A pause filled with sounds she had learned to interpret. The clicking of rapid keystrokes. The soft tones of data updating in real time. Propulsion signature is down 60%, maybe more. They're not moving for a while. Nora exhaled slowly, fogged the inside of her visor and cleared. "Okay," she said. "Okay. That. You just... I need to get inside," she said. "Get Shastri, get Rourke. We have a window, and we need to use it." She was back through the airlock in 11 minutes. She had the suit half off before the inner door finished cycling. Rourke was already in the corridor. His diagnostics, apparently, had concluded. And he had the look of a man who had heard the bell and was still processing whether it had rung for him or against him. She told him what Ewan had reported. He listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he was operating in the crisis mode rather than the command mode. "They'll respond." "Yes. We don't know how." "No. They gave us 60 hours to discuss compliance, and the 60 hours are up in." She checked her wrist display. 7 hours. "And right now, they have a problem they didn't have yesterday, which means we have a conversation they have to have." "Shastri?" "She needs to be the one asking for it. Officially." Nora paused. "But she needs to know what position we're actually in. What we actually demonstrated." Rourke was quiet for a moment. She watched him do the thing she had seen him do before critical decisions. The brief, almost invisible inward turn, the recalibration. "All right," he said.
"Let's go talk to the ambassador."
Priya Shastri sat at the briefing table and listened to Nora's account without moving. She was good at stillness, Nora had noticed. It was the stillness of someone who had trained herself not to telegraph reaction, because in her work, telegraphing reaction was something other people used against you. When Nora finished, Shastri was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You did this without authorization." "Yes, without telling Rourke." He had plausible deniability. It seemed important that someone have it. Shastri looked at Rourke. He said nothing. Shastri looked back at Nora. "And your assessment is that we now have leverage." "I think we have the beginning of a conversation they didn't plan to have," Nora said carefully. "They planned for the conversation where we ask how to comply. They may not have planned for the conversation where we say we have something they need to factor in." She paused. "They've done this before. Lots of times, probably. That's what the translation protocols and the 60 hours and the whole administrative tone of it says. They've optimized the process. They know exactly how long it takes." They know what arguments get made and how to shut them down. What they may not know is what to do with a variable they didn't model. And you think you're that variable. Nora thought about the emissary's gaze. A long, categorizing look. I think they came here to take an inventory, she said. I think we just complicated their inventory. The Veth responded to Shastri's request for communication in 40 minutes. Nora stood against the wall of the briefing room, while Shastri sat at the table and the screen resolved into the face of something that was not the voice. Something that had more rank, more presence, that communicated seniority through the simple physical fact of taking up more space in the frame, its form slower, its stillness, a different kind of stillness than the voices. This was the translator, told them, a coordinator. The coordinator said, through the disk, the interference event has been noted. Its origin has been identified. There will be consequences for the station's continued operation. Shastri said, I understand. Those consequences are determined. I would like to speak with you about the 60-hour window. It has not yet elapsed. In that pause, Nora breathed. The window was allocated for confirmation of compliance, the coordinator said.
Not for negotiation.
With respect, Shastri said, and she said it in the way that very skilled diplomats, things that contain their entire argument in the preamble. With respect, meaning not a smaller version of I disagree, but a larger version of I am about to show you something you need to see. With respect, the window was allocated for communication. That was the word used. The translation registered it as communication, not compliance. My colleague demonstrated something during that window that I believe constitutes relevant communication. Another pause. Longer this time, the interference event, the coordinator said, was unsanctioned. Yes, Shastri said. It was also effective. Nora kept her face neutral. She was very good at keeping her face neutral. The damage to your vessel's aft propulsion array, Shastri continued, in the same, composed, unhurried tone, represents a complication that your process did not account for. My colleague identified a pre-existing vulnerability and acted on it with materials available on this station. This station has limited resources by your standards, I suspect. I'd like you to consider what a fully resourced response from a world of 8 billion people might look like if they had 14 days and sufficient motivation. The coordinator was still for a long time. Long enough that Nora began to wonder if the transmission had frozen. Then it made a sound that the translator disk converted to silence, which she thought meant it had made a sound the disk did not have a corresponding word for. Species record, the coordinator said, finally, indicated a high probability of compliance. Our species record, Shastri said, is complicated. The damage to our systems can be repaired, I assume, if there's a reason to repair it rather than to use the same time developing further interventions. Shastri folded her hands on the table. I'm not threatening you. I'm trying to have a conversation that accounts for all available data, including my colleague's demonstration. Including the fact that she is not a specialist. She is what we call support staff. The coordinator's four eyes moved. It was the Fahark had seen a Veth show something that felt like reassessment. What is it you are asking for, the coordinator said. It was not quite a question. Time, Shastri said. Genuine time. Not 60 hours for compliance, but 60 days for actual discussion. About what you need, what we can offer, what an arrangement looks like that doesn't require the word most. She paused. You've done this before. Many times, presumably. I don't know what the usual result looks like. I know what your first offer looked like. I'm asking whether you're interested in what a negotiated version looks like. Silence. Then. This is outside standard process. I know, Shastri said. That's why I'm asking. The coordinator looked at her for a long moment. Then it looked past her at the wall where Nora stood. Nora met its four eyes. She thought, you don't know what to do with this. And underneath that, something warmer, more private. Neither do I. Here we are. She gave it the same small, flat smile she had given the voice. The coordinator spoke. Translator disk rendered it as 60 days will be allocated. Non-standard protocols will be flagged for review at our administrative level. This is not a concession. It is an extension. Understood, Shastri said. Thank you. The interference event will also be reviewed. Shastri glanced at Nora. Nora gave a small nod. Understood, Shastri said again. The transmission ended. Rourke let out a breath that sounded like a man who had been holding it for 47 hours. Ewan's voice came over the comm from the astrophysics bay. Did that actually? We have 60 days, Nora said. 60 days isn't. No, she agreed. Isn't everything. She looked at Shastri, who was sitting very still with her hands still folded on the table, her composure intact in the way that composure is intact after something that cost something. It's 60 days more than we had an hour ago. 60 days of actual talking instead of processing. What do we do with 60 days? Rourke asked. Nora picked up her maintenance log. She had been keeping the list there, in the margins, in her cramped zero-gravity handwriting. Items, resources, angles, variables. We get to work, she said. They got to work. What followed was not triumphant in the way of old stories, where the cavalry arrives, and the music swells, and the thing that threatened becomes the thing that retreated. It was smaller than that and larger than that simultaneously, the way all-important work is. Nora slept 5 hours a night and spent the rest in consultation with engineers on Earth who were running their own analyses, their own calculations, identifying their own leverage points, their own variables. Jan built a spectral map of the Veth ship's systems that grew more detailed by the day as he found new angles to observe from. Shastri talked to the coordinator for 6 hours on day 3 and came out of it looking both exhausted and strangely alive. The way that people who are very good at a very hard thing look when they are finally doing it under conditions that are worth being very good for. The Veth repaired their propulsion array. It took 8 days. Nora watched the timeline and did not let herself feel the vertigo of knowing that the window would have closed if it had taken 7. On day 11, the coordinator sent a secondary communication. Not a negotiation point, but a question. A question about the interference event, specifically about the methodology, about how the damage zone had been identified. There was something in the framing of the question that UN identified as significant. It had been directed not to the ambassador, but to the station, which meant they had parsed the crew structure, and Arf understood that the relevant knowledge was not in the diplomatic channel. Nora answered it herself. She wrote a technical summary of the spectral analysis that had led to the targeting coordinates, the EM array modification, the calculations. She wrote it the way she wrote maintenance logs. Precisely, without decoration, in the language of specifications and tolerances. She sent it. She didn't know what she expected in return. She got a 7-hour silence, and then a response that was 3 paragraphs of technical correction. The Veth's own account of the propulsion array damage, contradicting her model in 2 respects, and confirming it in 5. It was, unmistakably, the response of something that had read her document with attention and found it worth engaging with. Corrections were accurate. She had made 2 modeling errors. She acknowledged them. That was the beginning of a different kind of conversation. It was not peace. It was not alliance. It was not even trust, which is a thing that cannot be manufactured in 60 days between species that had been strangers for the entirety of their respective histories. What it was more complex and more durable than any of those things. It was the early stages of something like mutual recognition. The Veth had come to inventory. They had found, instead, something that complicated the inventory in ways that interested them, not in the way that a problem interests you when it presents an obstacle, but in the way that an unexpected variable interests a scientist, when it suggests that the model was incomplete. Humanity was not the model they had built. Or more precisely, the model had been built on the record, and the record was accurate, but there was something in the record that the Veth's previous processing had categorized as noise, something they had measured, but not weighted correctly. Because the species they had processed before that category showed up in the data had not had the specific combinations of factors that made the noise loud enough to matter. Coordinator explained this on day 31 in one of its more forthcoming moments. It said, through the disk, in the translation that always felt slightly compressed, like music heard through a wall, that the relevant factor was not the interference event itself. Any sufficiently technical species could have managed the interference event given the pre-existing damage and the information Ewan had developed. The relevant factor was the source, the individual who executed the event, the coordinator said. Your records classify this individual as... The disk rendered a pause that might have been a search. Support staff. Yes, Shastri said. Not a specialist in the relevant systems. No, she's a generalist. She does maintenance. The individual who conducted your technical correspondence with this vessel. The same person. This is not, the coordinator said, typical. In our records of your species operation, individuals of this classifications do not typically engage at this level of initiative. Shastri looked at Nora, who was again standing against the wall. She does, Shastri said simply. She's been doing it for years. We just don't always notice. The coordinator made the sound that the disk translated as silence, the untranslatable one. This is the variable, it said. Yes, Shastri said. It was not the end of anything. Nora had never expected it to be. The 60 days became 90, and the 90 became a framework, something skeletal and provisional and requiring more work than she could currently imagine. A scaffolding rather than a building. Earth's governments were involved. Necessarily, messily, in all the ways that 8 billion people being involved in anything is necessarily messy. There were arguments she wasn't in the room for. Decisions that were made over her head by people who had the authorization to make them. The vet sent 3 more emissaries of different types for different purposes, and Waystation Kepler became something it had never been designed to be. The first contact point of an ongoing process, a crossing rather than a way station. She was still the maintenance person. She still ran her suit checks. She still repaired the things that broke. And things kept breaking because things always did. And she still added songs to her playlist. And on her 213th spacewalk, she hummed her mother's tune and looked at the Veth ship from the outside and felt, not safety, not certainty, but the specific and sufficient feeling of having changed the shape of what was possible. There was a reporter who managed through complicated channels to get a communication link to the station in week 8. He wanted the story of the interference event, which had by then leaked and been reported on, and disputed and confirmed and reported on again. He wanted the heroic version, the turning point version. He wanted to know what Nora had been thinking when she made the modifications. When she went Evia, when she fired the pulse. She thought about this for a moment. I was thinking about my maintenance log, she said. I had a list. I was working through the list. He clearly found this unsatisfying. Were you scared? Yes. What was the scariest part? She thought about the coordinator's gaze. About the sound the disc couldn't translate. About the specific vertigo of being categorized as noise and turning out to be the relevant variable. The scariest part, she said, was the possibility that I'd done the math wrong. She paused. I'd done it 5 times. Pretty sure I hadn't. But that's the thing about math. You're never completely sure until you test it. He asked more questions. She answered the ones that were worth answering, and deflected the ones that were looking for something she couldn't honestly give him. At the end, he asked if she considered herself a hero. Nora thought about this genuinely. I'm the backup, she said. I'm what you bring along, because every serious endeavor needs someone who can spacewalk, and who can get into the small spaces, and who doesn't mind being the 3rd most important person in the room. She paused. Turns out that's actually useful. 3rd most important person in the room is the one who was paying attention while everyone else was busy being important. He seemed to like that. She suspected he would misquote it. She went back to her maintenance log. Dean. There was a junction on the port side that had been showing anomalous resistance values for a week, and she had been putting it off because of everything else, and it needed looking at before it became a problem. It was, she estimated, a 2-hour job. She would go Eva in the morning, after sleep, after she added something to the playlist. She had been thinking about a Hank Williams song her father used to play, the one about wandering, and whether it translated into the context of a woman hanging off the hull of a station in high orbit, and she thought it probably did, the way all songs about going a long way from home translated. She would check the junction. She would do it right. And somewhere in the solar system, a species that had come to take inventory was reconsidering the column headers. That was enough. That was for now exactly enough.